Forum Borealis Paradigm Expansion.
Greetings from the north and welcome to the forum today called Gnosis, Forbidden Self-Discovery. Tonight's guest is Timothy Warren Hogan, who is an author, researcher, and initiate of several different spiritual and esoteric traditions, including many bodies of Freemasonry, Martinism, and Rosicrucian lineages. He is the current Grand Master for the Ordre Souverain du Temple Initiatique, which is one of the oldest Knight Templar lineages, and President of CIRCES International, also known as the Templar Research Institute, a school for personal cultivation that studies the world's cultures and spiritual traditions throughout history. Additionally, he is a former editor and has also written for several periodicals over the last decade, including L'Initiation, or Initiation, the New Equinox Journal, the Scottish Rite Journal, and Herodom, Ariadne's Web, and currently writes for Livingstone's magazine. He has lectured all over the world in both public and private venues and has appeared on numerous television programs worldwide, as well as multiple podcasts and radio interviews. He also works as COO of Elite Sterling Security and is one of the founders of the cigar shop Fraternitas Cigars. We have invited him on to elaborate on the mysterious Gnosis and the Gnostic currents that celebrated that concept, of which Hogan is considered an expert from his many lectures on the topic, as well as from his books, in particular Entering the Chain of Union, which is the basis for today's conversation. This program is the first in a series of investigations into lesser-known yet noteworthy spiritual currents of the world. Welcome back to the forum, Timothy.
Thank you.
I'm saying welcome back even though this will be our first program with you, because what our listeners don't know is that we recorded a smashing show with you where we took on the Templars. But unfortunately, the curse seems to be resonating still. We had some problems, and we're working on that program, trying to get it out. And we're going to rework it a little, and we're going to have you back to fix the part that didn't work, and then we're going to release it. And I can assure our listeners it's worth the wait. That program we've called Covert History of the Knights Templars, and we're really touching upon every aspect of that legendary riddled group. But today, we've invited you on because you're such a resource on a host of related topics. So today we're going to take on the mysterious Gnostics. And you have written a book on the Gnostics, isn't that right?
Yeah, my book, Entering the Chain of Union, primarily covers some Gnostic beliefs and philosophies and it's a exploration of different strains of Gnosticism that have existed in the past and how they've developed in the past up through the modern day and how they relate to modern traditions that are practicing forms of Gnosticism today.
Right.
And how they're all related.
Yeah. Now let's begin with understanding what Gnosticism is, because it's very hyped these days. You find it all over the place. I think the basics is always a good place to start. And if we look at the word, we can see that it has a similarity, for instance, with the word agnostic.
Yes.
Could you explain what the word means?
Yeah, so the word Gnostic comes from Gnosis in Greek, and Gnosis just means to know. But it doesn't mean knowledge in the way we normally associate it with, like the memorization of facts. Instead, it alludes to an experiential knowledge, and it was deemed to be a divine knowledge or something that came directly from the mind of the Creator. And consequently, the word gnosis in Greek is very similar to words that we find in Eastern traditions like enlightenment and nirvana and other ideas like this. It represents a personal, experiential awakening and knowledge to the greater consciousness of the Creator and the universe.
And this is an interesting concept because if you take a look at spiritual and religious traditions in the world, you can kind of distinguish between two main groups. On the one hand, you have those that profess that access to the Almighty is through some appointed people, like a priesthood.
Right.
And also similarly that the access from the Almighty to the people are through the same middleman, so to speak, the handlers of God.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and then you have the other kind of groups which claims that no, you as an individual human being do have direct access to the source, and then they have a lot of words to describe this, and there we can find words like gnosis, right?
Correct.
Like illumination. In German, they have a very good word that I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's Erkennung, and it's about, like you said, it's about an experienced realization. It's like a deeper insight, not just this shallow fact-based information, but it's like when you grasp something and integrate it into you so that knowledge becomes wisdom. Couldn't we say that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, gnosis is something you feel in your bones, so to speak. It's an experience that you know with all of your being. And it defies, in some ways, it even defies rational understanding. But the belief is once someone experiences an awakening of gnosis, then they know beyond a doubt that there is a Creator and that our consciousness is somehow connected with that greater consciousness of the Creator. And once someone knows that, there's no going back. And this is one of the differences between the word Gnostic and agnostic, because the word agnostic, of course, means not to know. So that word gnosis is still in agnostic, but an agnostic is one who doesn't know. They don't know, they don't know if there's a God or not, and that's just where they're at. Whereas a Gnostic is one that knows completely because they've had a direct experience that has somehow guided them in their life or guided their perception and has led to deeper insight and wisdom.
Could we say that the road from ignorance to enlightenment, illumination, then would be that the first step is to be an agnostic, to accept that you don't know, and then to search for that inner connection so that you become one who knows?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's the first step is to realize we don't know anything, and that most of what we think we know has just been a form of cultural conditioning that has been indoctrinated into us throughout our life. And then the second step is realizing, hey, maybe we don't know, and then from there we can be open to the possibility of an experience of true knowing. But we have to give up a lot of what we've previously thought was true in order to be open to new possibility.
Yeah, that's an old problem, Dogma is so hard, it's so crystallized in people's mind. I mean, people would rather die than adjust their paradigm at the point where they don't choose it themselves. And indeed, I think that in order to adjust your paradigm, you need to detach yourself from false identification points. At the lowest level, people's primary identification is with their body. Then I would say that the next level would be with your emotions, then with your intellect, meaning you can always see people who are identified with opinions, with ideas, right? They take it personally if you express something that goes against what they believe, what they entertain as truth. And that's, you see that especially among fundamentalists. They're so wrapped up with their ideas that it's their notion of self. But could you say that a true Gnostic has a deeper identification, is not identified with the body, with the emotions, with the thoughts, but with something more causal, with something more essential?
Yes, in fact, in the ancient Gnostic traditions, which some have theorized, it's hard to say how far back Gnosticism goes. Some have associated it with, for example, Pythagoras' school. His Pythagorean school was a form of Gnostic instruction. People have looked to the allegory of Plato with his cave allegory as being a Gnostic metaphor.
Obviously, Plato was a Pythagorean, but you also have the fire worshippers, the Zarathustras, Zoroasters.
That's right.
And ancient traditions.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a number of ancient traditions, and one of the things that seems to be consistent across these traditions is the idea that at some point you have to symbolically die to your image of your old self in order to be open to new illumination. And consequently, a number of the early Gnostic schools developed initiation rites that illustrated this idea of a symbolic death and awakening to the new light of Gnosis. And it should be pointed out that the word, for example, in the New Testament, the word resurrection actually comes from the Greek word anastasis, which just means awakening. And so the Gnostics interpreted the awakening of Jesus, or the resurrection of Jesus, as a metaphor to the awakening to Gnosis, as opposed to a literal corpse of a physical body waking up and starting to walk around again like a zombie. So.
Yeah, well, this is the opposite of a zombie, isn't it?
Yes.
But if we look at the ancient traditions predating the Abrahamic religions, and we're going to get to Christianity and Gnosticism in that regard, but if we do look at the pre-Abrahamic traditions, isn't it true that we find this concept you just mentioned also, for instance, among the ancient Egyptians?
Yeah, absolutely. The fundamental to the idea of Gnosticism was that there was one consciousness, and that every individual consciousnesses were just aspects of this greater consciousness. And they had closed themselves off and separated themselves, and consequently the experience of Gnosis is part of getting back to that oneness. And consequently the stories of Osiris in ancient Egypt, for example, were taken to be allegories for this process of, in the story of Osiris, his body is chopped up into all of these individual pieces. And then Isis has to recollect all those pieces and put them back together into the oneness.
Right.
And this is a metaphor for how our own soul needs to recognize that all the things that we think are separate and distinct need to be regathered back into the realization of oneness.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah, or the monad, as the Pythagorean tradition would say, that it has to go back to that one source.
Yeah, or union, as you say in your book here. Yeah, or yoga, as it's called in Indian tradition.
Yes.
It's so interesting if you look at the words that the different tradition uses for this path. In Taoisms, they say Tao means path.
Yeah, path or way. Yes.
Yeah, and in Kabbalism, it's called Kabbalah. It means tradition.
Yes.
And you have so many similar words that point to this same thing. You have, like I said, yoga, oneness, gnosis, to know. All of these things are related, and indeed, I would claim, and give us your take on this. I would claim that if we look at the oldest spiritual traditions in the world, and then I mean both in the East and the West. I mean I could mention the Toltec among the Amerindians, and the Mayan, the Egyptian I mentioned, the Sufi among the Islamic, the Kabbalism among the Judaism, the Druze, the Hermeticism, and of course in Eastern we also have like the Brahmans and the Tantra and the Vajrayana Buddhism. I think, and here's my allegation, I think that all these traditions are remnants, are survivals of a common source, an older, should I say, oneness, because we have another series in the forum where we examine the evidence for an antediluvian civilization. And if that concept is genuine, then indeed we should expect surviving pockets of spiritual traditions. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, a lot of the Gnostic literature of the last 2,000 years don't necessarily talk as much about antediluvian civilizations, though the story of Noah's Ark is sometimes believed to be both a story for the passing on of a tradition since pre-flood times, along with a metaphor for the Gnostic process of awakening. But I believe that there was a primordial tradition that these things came out of, and that this idea of gnosis is, even though it may be called by different names, it is fundamental to our human nature and fundamental to these early traditions. And, we look at, as an example, in ancient times, the priesthoods of the different religions, it would have been absurd for them to be fighting with other priesthoods. This is a very modern concept, right. where one religion fights against another religion, and that would have been unheard of in the ancient world. In the ancient world, the priests recognized the priests from other religions as also priests of the same tradition.
Yeah, and they exchanged.
Yeah, they exchanged. That's right. I mean, this is why, for example, we see Alexander the Great sacrificing at the altars of all the different gods, including the god of the Jews, because he recognized that they were all celebrating the same divine mystery, even though it may be coming across in different ways, or there may be different cultural names, placed on that mystery, but ultimately it was the same mystery.
Right. Yeah, here's an idea I want to pitch you. The problem today is that people do exactly that stupid thing you talked about. They look at the outer shell, the labels, they look at the masks of our traditions. It's equivalent to judging a book on its cover or a person on its face, instead of acknowledging the essence, the contents of the book, or the personality of an individual. Now, they do the same thing with religions, the spiritual tradition. And here's the point, that there's actually three traditions, or should I say stratas, or ways to relate to the divine, to the sacred. One is those who deny the material world and say that the only reality is up there, it's beyond, it's God, if you like, and all of this is illusion, it's Maya. Then you have the opposite, which says no, this here is the only, what you can sense is the only reality, matter, and the world beyond is an illusion. Now, those two poles, if you like, love to fight. And they kind of are antagonistic towards each other, and they are mutually dependent on each other. But then you have this third, more quiet streams that says that neither, actually both are correct. We are both here and there at the same time. In a way, you could say that it's a spiritual materialism or a materialistic spiritualism. In fact, some call it hylozoics, I think.
Yeah.
So how do you account for that view?
Well, I think a lot of it goes back to the Hermetic idea that, look, if you are the creator and you're all that is, that means there's nothing outside of yourself. And the only way you can create is within your own mind. And by that logic, then, everything that we see and experience in this world is just within the mind of God. And consequently, the trick is not to get caught up in the manifestations and in the illusion of thinking it's just material and that's it, but recognizing that there's a mind behind it, that there's a consciousness behind it, and that consciousness is the real reality. It's not the manifestations of that consciousness. And this was a very Gnostic idea that, look, it's not that material world is evil, it's that our attachment to the material world is evil, because if we become too attached to it, we can miss the meaning that's behind it. And in that meaning is where the Gnosis lies, and that meaning is where that's the roadmap back to the mind of God.
So like Kybalion claims then that all is mind, that consciousness really is the primordial impulse to existence.
Yeah, that's right. In which several physicists have agreed over the last century.
Yeah, quantum physicism is kind of science rediscovering the ancient concepts. I mean, I've seen so many physics books that compares ancient thoughts with modern findings. You have famous books like, for instance, Fritjof Capra, The Tao of Physics. And it seems to me, actually, that the higher up you are in physics, like in astro and quantum physics, I'm not talking about the ordinary school teachers, but really people who are in the forefront of researching this, it seems that their spirituality is not materialism, so many other so-called scientists seem to adhere to, but that they are either identifying with Neoplatonism, Pythagoreanism, or Hermeticism, or Taoism, or yoga, etc., etc., etc. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that when you examine the material world deep enough, either if you go in the smallest things, like you zoom in as in quantum, or if you zoom out as in astro, you kind of realize that, wow.
Yeah.
This is an illusion.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a Sir Arthur Eddington, the famous physicist, said, physics is the study of the structure of consciousness. The stuff of the world is mind stuff. something unknown is doing we don't know what.
Right.
I mean, it's been acknowledged for at least a century now that look, there appears to be, if we just study it from a scientific standpoint, there's a greater consciousness, organizing consciousness behind creation itself. And this is what the Gnostics have always said. They've said, look, there's a greater consciousness behind things, and if we focus on that, not only can we attune to it and have it be a guiding force in our lives, but we can live our lives in more of a better natural order of how that consciousness structures itself, so we don't create as many problems for ourselves or the world or other people around us.
Yeah. I think that the awakening was kind of neatly illustrated for the masses in the movie Matrix, which many people don't know actually. They took the whole concept from Gnostic lore.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, one of the stories, one of the mythos within Gnosticism was this idea that it was based on the idea of it tells the story of Sophia, who is wisdom, and Sophia fell to this earth and she became totally addicted to matter. The old Gnostic texts talk about how she basically copulated with everything, becoming, because she was so attached to it all. But then as she worked through that process, she began to realize that where the true source of things was, and eventually she ended up wedding with the universal consciousness, which was called the Christos in a lot of these early Gnostic texts. And consequently, her individual consciousness united with the greater consciousness of God. And in many ways, it's the story of the fall and then the reintegration of humanity into the greater collective consciousness. But you see a similar story with this idea of in the Matrix, where you have the hero of the story, Neo, who he goes through life.
And Neo, by the way, means new.
Which means new. That's correct. Yeah. He's attached to the world, and he's learning to work his way through it. And then at some point, he has to die to it, and then he's raised from that death through the love of Trinity, who represents that Sophia coming in contact with the greater divine, and then he comes to this greater realization and.
Well, it's interesting because if you look at his psychopomp, his soul guide, Morpheus.
Yeah.
Morpheus obviously is a god of the other realm, the dreams. He's an impulse from the consciousness.
Yes.
So he has to cooperate to become new, to become himself. He has to cooperate, as you said, with Trinity, which is the three forces of creation.
Yeah.
It's tees, antithees, and synthees, or as they say in the more mythical religions, like in Christianity, God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And then you have the interesting thing, he has to visit the oracle. And if you paid close attention, you'll see that above the oracle's door, above the gateway.
Yes.
Did you remember what was written there?
Yeah, well, it was, I know it was Noisatan, but I don't think it was, or Know Thyself, but I think it was in Latin as opposed to in the Greek.
Exactly. And that's where we tie it in, right? Because to know yourself is the clue, isn't it? To Gnosis, to give birth to this inner Gnosis then.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, and to the Gnostics, it should be pointed out that this Sophia archetype actually represented the human soul that incarnates in this world, becomes a soul of personality, and thinks it's detached from everything else. But then eventually it's able to wed with the greater consciousness. And
is this alchemical wedding?
this is the alchemical wedding, yeah. And this is why even in Christianity, when Paul talks about how we need to make Christ our husband, he's alluding to our soul, the Sophia, wedding with the universal consciousness, the Christos. And through that wedding, the union occurs where we get back to the oneness.
Now, if we assume the somewhat conspiratorial but still founded concept that all great ideas, spiritual births in the world, the original impulses of all religious traditions, at some point gets hijacked by one of these antagonistic traditions I talked about, like everything here is real and that is an illusion, or no, everything there is real and this is an illusion. Then you get these guardians, right? These people who want to hijack the connection, this priesthood, these churches.
Yeah.
Now, would that make sense, that concept, if we look at, let's take Christianity then, that they say that, okay, let's make a war on the sacred feminine. Let's exclude that part because it's such a dangerous part, because if people do marry it or make love to it, they will wake up and we can't control them anymore. Is Sophia then the lost sacred feminine impulse of the Abrahamic traditions?
Yeah, it is, for sure. And what's happened with priesthoods of all religions, and and I'm not trying to bash religions, but oftentimes religions have set themselves up as the middleman between the person and God, and you can charge a lot of money by being the middleman. So there's a lot of power there, yeah. And the Gnostics have always said, look, you don't need a middleman. That connection with God is a fundamental part of who you are. You just have to wake up to it. And consequently, this is why the Gnostics have also always been persecuted by different religious establishments that have sought to control.
Yeah, because these two antagonistic forces, the everything here is real or the everything there is real and let's fight, to them, they actually, like I said, they are mutually dependent on each other. Their real enemy would be everybody who tries to console those two poles. And isn't that why all Gnostic traditions, be that in the West or the East, always have been persecuted, always have been marginalized, and never have managed to be a movement for the masses, because at most times, as we know in known history, it hasn't been a good market. It's very hard to get most people into such a concept. So it's much easier to herd them and control them through some kind of dogmatic middleman structure.
Well, yeah, and the reality is, I mean, the Gnostics said that about 80% of the population is asleep. Anyways, they kind of want to be controlled because they don't know what they're doing or where they're going or what they believe, and it's easier for someone else to think for you. And so the priesthoods have always monopolized on that. And but the Gnostics said, at some point you have to wake up for yourself, and that process usually starts out with the person realizing initially that they're more than just a physical body, They're more than just a physical form with physical needs, that there's a deeper part of themselves. And then they have to wake up to the fact that there's a whole emotional side to them, and that their emotions can be used for change in the world as opposed to something that just consumes them. And then they had to wake up to the mental side of themselves, and that the recognition that their mind is actually just part of a greater mind or a greater consciousness, and that there's a greater connection between things. And then once they worked through all of that, then they were ready to symbolically die to the world in their own way of relating to it, and wake up to new revelation of who they really were, or who they really are, why they're really here, and what they really have to offer. And that's right, where Gnosis would reside. But that whole process takes time, and it takes courage on the part of people wanting to truly examine themselves deeper. And until people are willing to do that, they will always be slaves to others that can manipulate them.
Yeah, people who are even more asleep. I think it's a beautiful picture you're painting there. In fact, I want to suggest a symbolic illustration of that path. If you look at the old alchemical, not just in alchemy, but the old concept of the four elements, you can say that first you have to balance or harmonize earth, which would be, your body, the senses. You have to live in a healthy body to balance earth. Then you need to clean your emotions, like you said, the water aspect of things. You have to balance, to still the water.
Yes.
Then you have to still the winds, the air, to get your clarity in thought, as Buddha pointed out. And then, only then, when earth, oceans and winds are still, can the sun shine bright through, and you can enter fire, the last element. And isn't this the concept then, that when these four elements are balanced, a fifth, the quintessence, the ether, if you like, can be like, if you look at the four elements as a cross, 4 points.
Yes.
And if they are all in balance, then can that seed that is our soul or consciousness, our primordial essence, then it can flourish, grow like the rose on the cross, so to speak.
That's exactly right. And in fact, this is the reason why there were so many alchemists that chose esoteric names for themselves that were named after early Gnostic leaders. Right. And it's also the reason why the early Gnostic systems, when you talk about groups like the Valentinians or the Manichaeans or the Polycans or the Mandeans, or all these different Gnostic groups, they did different baptismal rites that represented the different stages of awakening. And the first baptism was by water, the second baptism was by air, and the third was by fire.
So that kind of marks the transition points between those steps, right?
That's right. Yeah, it goes from taking earth to water, water to air, air to fire, and then fire to the quintessence. And this is also the reason why they looked at the story of Noah's Ark as not only relating to the preservation of lost knowledge from before the flood, but it also alluded to the same period, same steps of awakening. Because in the story of Noah's Ark, the earth is obsessed with its physical senses, and then along comes a flood, which is water. And then Noah lets birds go into the air, which is air. And then he lands on Mount Ararat and makes a burnt sacrifice to God, which is fire. So
interesting.
So it goes through these steps, and and this is also why you have in the New Testament you have Jesus saying, "Those who came before me baptized with water and spiritus," which was another name for air. "I've come to baptize with fire."
And sword is also a symbol of fire, so
That's right.
No wonder he claimed he came to bring the sword. Now, we just want to interject here that the Noah myth is the same as the Gilgamesh epos in Sumeria, where they, by the way, have found new, but now it's emerged new parts of the text that wasn't known before. And I want to say that when we examine myths, people have to be aware that yes, you can interpret myths literally, as it's kind of a way to preserve knowledge about events. But one should also realize that, like in ancient alien people, ancient astronauts, they have a tendency to take everything literally.
Right.
Then you have the opposite, which is to, no, has nothing to do with what has happened. It's all a dramaturgy in our mind. But I'd venture that the real esoteric way to view it is that myths and legends have several simultaneous stratas, that they have layers that harmonize, that you have both. You can talk about planetary realities, you can talk about them being aspects of psychology, but you can also talk about them being historical, that it all dovetails with each other. It's not an either or, but it's like, earth, water, air, and fire are all simultaneous reality at the same time, all comprised in the myths. That's my pet point. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I once said that one of my teachers said you need to learn to read myth as history and history as myth.
Excellent.
And once you find that middle ground, then you'll have a pretty good idea of what the meaning is behind it.
That's such a good saying. Now, if you look at the Bible then, we have a point in, it may be Genesis, where God is asked of his name, and God says, "Ego sum qui sum."
Yeah.
Now, what does that mean?
Yeah, I am that I am. I mean, the idea that God is, and really, when you from a Gnostic perspective, the thought of it is, as soon as you're able to define yourself as a conscious being, behind that consciousness is the consciousness of God.
Right.
So by saying I am as a conscious being, you are also stating that you are part of that consciousness of God itself.
Yeah.
But what's happened is religious establishments have interpreted this as, have made it into an anthropomorphic being,
with beard.
With a beard.
An old man with a beard.
Yeah, that's trying to, do whatever. But I think this is what Descartes was really trying to point to when he said, I think, therefore I am. He was pointing to a deeper esoteric mystery that... is lost on the profane.
Yeah, and if you look at, I think it was Halevi, the British Kabbalist, who, obviously in Kabbalah they use Hebrew, so it's, I think it's Asher or something.
Yes.
But if you look at what you just said a while ago, that if everything is one, and everything is mind, and you want to make some action, it's too boring, it's static, we need some dynamics here, then you need to do a distinction within yourself so that you kind of part within the one in order to get to, from monad to dyad. But the interesting thing here is that if you look at this as a circle, and let's say at the top of the circle is the starting point, that it would be I am. Then you have that, which is not
myself. It's not me. It's not. It's something else. It's that. It's the world of the creation. And then, but he didn't say I am that. He said I am that I am. So that's the way back, so to speak. So that the last part, I am, is that you die in that, in the matter, and then you awaken again, like you said, in the realization of the gnosis of who am I? Gnosis auton, know thyself. Oh, I am. That's who I am. I am.
That's
So
right.
I am that
That's right.
I am.
That's right.
Complete circle.
That's exactly right. Yes, you return.
Right.
Return to the source. A number of Gnostic traditions, both in Kabbalistic and even Sufi traditions, I might add, which are a Gnostic form of Gnosticism, have looked to the metaphor of the story of the Garden of Eden as representing our original state of consciousness when we were close to God, and then we fell into the idea of separation and fell into the idea of distinction and classification, and we created separation. And only through working through all of that, then are we able to return back to the garden, or return back to our original consciousness connected with God. And this is very much tied into Kabbalistic traditions related to the breaking of the vessels, the shattering of the different pieces of the original light that need to be recollected and put back together, and really we're recollecting the fragmentations of ourself. When we define things in the world, we're really defining our relationship to these things, and ultimately the conclusion is they're all related to us, otherwise we wouldn't be able to define them.
I mean, if we weren't one, we couldn't even make offspring. A man meeting a woman, resulting in a child, that's just a material manifestation of our oneness.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And when you talk about that we live in a fragmented world, I think that the illusion of this level we're living in is that we are lost in the creation, so to speak. Instead of identifying with the wholeness, we kind of single out one little piece of the puzzle, and this is me. Everything else, to hell with it.
That's right. That's right.
And if every single atom did like that, the whole organism would collapse, wouldn't it?
That's right. And this is, every problem that we face in the world today is a result of that kind of thinking, And so this is part of the reason why this striving to this greater way of Gnostic perception is our only salvation for bringing us back together and resolving, some of the conflicts and everything else that people fight over today.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
I actually got a realization from what we talked about already. You said you talked about baptism between every level. I just realized that the 7 steps in masonry, or in alchemy if you like,
Yes.
is the 4 elements and the intermediate levels between them.
That's exactly right.
So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's exactly what that is. Yes. Yeah, those 4 levels are, ultimately the 7. I mean, that's where you also get the idea of in the Eastern traditions, the 7 chakra or psychic centers, the expressions of consciousness within the body, and this is also tied into the 7 seals before Revelations. To the Gnostics, Revelations wasn't about the end of the world. It was about the end of our perceptions of the world and the awakening to the new revelation of the consciousness behind the world.
Right.
So the set with the opening of each seal, these represented these 7 seals represented the 7 levels of consciousness within ourselves that each have to be opened gradually, and as they are, there's a part of how we identified with the world before that dies away.
Yeah.
And a new awakening comes out of it. And and it could be said that there's a reason why you find this same number 7 tied in with of course the 7 planets in antiquity that the alchemists related, the 7 metals, and then of course you can get into the Pythagorean ideas of the octave, that there were the 7 notes and then the 8th notes,
Yeah, I was going to say that science confirms it, because everything is vibration, and vibration works in 7 steps.
That's right.
So there's, like you said, 7 octaves, 7 color tones, and that's just the vibrations that we can perceive with the eye and the ears. But everything is vibration. Everything vibrates in 7. And when you tie in the, let's say then the Genesis, you have the interesting fact that God created the world in 6 days, and in the 7th he rested, which is kind of logical, because you have the 6 steps, which one could say is the triangle of the material world and the triangle of the non-material world fused together, because you talked about the separations within, and creation is a 3 something, it's a trinity. So you have the physical trinity and a non-physical trinity harmonizing in 6. But the interesting thing is, if you're a painter, for instance, and you're going to create something, you cannot just do it. You have to take a step back at some point and behold and take in and perceive what you've created, which is what they say in Genesis. God saw what he had done, and everything was good. So that's the 7th, that's the final initiation, when you take a step back and you receive, you realize it's not just pushing actively anymore, but it's kind of letting it coming back to you. Otherwise it wouldn't be a marriage. If you just give and give and give, you have to receive too. I'm rambling now, but what do you think about that?
No, I think that's completely right. Even within Genesis, where it talks about the Spirit of God, hovering over the waters, so to speak. Yeah. Well, what happens when you look at water? You see your own reflection.
Narcissus.
That's right. And so in a sense, we, our so-called physical world, which is just the consciousness of God, I mean, it's the reflection of his consciousness. And so, God, by this logic, the Gnostics and Kabbalists and, other traditions have alluded to the idea that God is learning about himself through our creation, which is all in his own head. And we're a part of his learning process. Our experiences are part of his learning process.
Mm-hmm. I think it's in the Gurdjieff tradition that they talk about that. Well, many traditions say that creation it's not like you have the creator and then you have the creation and it's done. It's like we're still in an unfolding creation. But the interesting thing in the Gurdjieff tradition, and that's based on ancient Gnostic and Sufi, and even some Buddhism, I think, is that we are kind of producing energy that the spiritual level receives back. I think I'm in deep water. I don't know if it's a very listener-friendly concept to talk with you about this here and now, but do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah. It's deep. You're getting deep, but that's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All of our files are free and will remain free. If you like the show, You can show support by donating $1 to help with expenses. Just use the PayPal link on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Thanks.
But let's rather tie it into science again before we move on to history and Christianity and all that, because I claimed a while ago that science is kind of reconfirming these things. And indeed, if you look at the new realizations of science the last, I'd say maybe the last 30 years, you have the notion that everything is holographic. Now, the holographic principle means that you really don't need all the bits and pieces in order to reconstruct the whole. In fact, you only need one piece, and if you examine that one piece, you'll see that the principle of the whole is repeated, is replicated within that small piece, which means that if you have not just one piece, well, one piece is enough, but if you even have several pieces, you can kind of piece together the whole existence just based on those pieces of the puzzle. And that goes to show that Gnosticism has something going for it, because otherwise you could say that, hey, how could just little me be enough to understand everything? And cosmos is so huge, not just materially speaking, but dimensionally speaking and everything. But then, lo and behold, if thing is holographic, and you have a few pieces of the puzzle, you can reconstruct the whole.
Yeah.
And that's where you get the notions of Hermetism, like as above, so below.
Yes.
Or as without, so within.
Yes.
That things are connected. We are a part of the whole. Want to say something about that?
Well, even with there's been a lot of news stories recently about where physicists are confirming the theories of quantum entanglement, in which particles that are at one point in time together and seem to be operating as a unit, as you separate them across a great deal of space, if you affect one, it still affects the other particle.
Yeah.
Even though they're separated over, vastness of space, which seems to suggest that there's a connected memory that's retained. And the only way that's possible is if there's a greater consciousness unit behind it. Because there's no physical force that's operating at that point for them to be able to, for one to act upon the other when it's such vast distances away from each other. So the fact that, that they are proving quantum entanglement at this point is just another example of, look, there has to be some sort of greater mind that's behind all of this, and things really are tied together on deeper levels than we normally like to acknowledge. And I will say one other thing. Part of the reason why this is uncomfortable for people, and part of the reason why many people don't like to look at Gnostic belief system, is it implies that, look, if our thoughts are affecting our reality, and our thoughts are a part of a bigger consciousness unit, then we are 100% responsible for everything that happens to us. And nobody wants to take responsibility.
No, but I see another aspect to that, and that is that it is also a liberating aspect, that the powers that be don't want us to realize.
Of course.
Because we also have the power if we have the responsibility.
That's right.
And if everyone around me walked around liberating themselves and thereby also liberating the world, I'd lose my power over them. And as you know, power is probably the biggest addictive of all. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And if I'm an absolute corrupt person, I would want to hold you back.
Yeah, that's right. Well, people have people have figured out that they can, manipulate others by taking their power away from them. I mean, anytime someone asks you to be afraid of something, what they're really asking you to do is to give your power away to them.
Yes.
And people forget that.
And those people who gets off on controlling others are probably the most afraid people of all, because behind the curtain, if you expose them, if they lose their power, they become very pathetic, afraid, shrinking shells, because these are the people who have the least power over themselves.
That's correct.
In people's consciousness, you have images from news, like remember Saddam Hussein?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he was such a fierce force in Iraq. People feared him, right? And then we have the image of him in the hole, where he was
in the little cave, the ground.
Yes, and I wonder how Bush or Blair would look in a similar situation. Probably just as pathetic as,
of course,
as a Gaddafi or as a Saddam. So it's just sad how these people, these power people, manage to, based upon like they cannibalize on other people's energy in order to keep themselves on top of the material system, so to speak.
Well, and this is where the Gnostics said, look, if you're going to place your attachment on materialism, then it's a shaky ground. You're not really rooted in what's really behind things. You're rooted in a ever-changing, unstable thing that is tied to time and place, and consequently limited, very limited. And so you're always going to be afraid, and you're always going to be a slave to someone else, because you're not rooted in timelessness, and you're not rooted in a power that's all pervasive and embodies all people and all things. And
well, I think the ultimate subversive force is to become a Gnostic, because there's no bigger threat to the powers that be than someone who is detached from the illusions, the world where they get their powers, and who identifies with the source that is common to us all.
Yeah, and there's been, it should be pointed out, there have been some, misinterpretations over the centuries by historians who have looked at Gnostics and have just said that they were just dualists.
Yeah.
Where they believed that there was a god of light and a god of darkness, and the god of light is always fighting against the world of darkness, and
Ahura Mazda.
Yeah, and that we have to unite with the god of light in order to destroy the god of materialism. But what they're doing is they're anthropomorphizing and taking these things literally. To the Gnostics, these were metaphors. And they had to do with what we're allowing our consciousness to be associated with and attached to, and that they didn't literally believe that there was a God that created the physical world and is trying to keep people away from the greater realm of light. They looked at it as a metaphor, in that we have to. It's one thing to acknowledge, hey, we live in a physical world and we have physical needs. I mean, if you don't eat, you're going to die. If you don't go to the bathroom, you're going to die. I mean, there are certain physical things you need to do in order to keep acting as a conscious being in this realm. But the trick is not to become attached to that and not to allow that to be your entire reality.
So you could say that Buddha was a Gnostic.
Absolutely. Yeah, and in fact, the Gnostics acknowledged that most religious leaders, that started different religions were Gnostics. They just they had an experience of illumination, and they tried to come back and teach that to the culture or the tradition, and using the language of the people in which they lived. And consequently, it turned into religious movements. But for example, the Gnostic would have no problem looking at like a Taoist and like Lao Tzu, the things that Lao Tzu says, and relating to them as part of the Gnostic process, and then also being able to look at the story of Muhammad, for example, in which Muhammad goes into a cave and he achieves illumination, and then he leaves the cave and he begins to teach a doctrine of oneness.
That's such a. In fact, that concept goes back to ancient Greece, where you see that in, for instance, Parmenides, in several of these ancient Greek enlightened people who they had this Hesha style of incubation, where they went into the cave, like Pythagoras, where they sought stillness, and when they come back, and this is actually the origin of the word prophet. People today think that prophet means someone who can predict what will happen. But in ancient times, what it really was someone who entered the realm beyond through the incubation in the cave, the stillness, and then they got in connection with an impulse which they brought with them back to the world. And the real challenge, the real trick was to be able to grasp something of the other world and bring it back to us, to share it with us, something that we could use. And in that respect is how, for instance, Muhammad was a prophet.
Yeah, and exactly. And to the Gnostics, the most famous groups that are considered Gnostic, they applied the same metaphor to the Christian Bible, and they said that, look, when it's no accident that, according to one of the biblical tradition, Jesus was born in a cave, and then later on, Mary Magdalene proclaims, the tomb is empty,
right,
or the cave is empty. In other words, Mary Magdalene represented the Sophia,
the Holy Feminine.
That's right, and Jesus represented the Christos, and that there was the realization that, look, the physical form, if that's all you're attached to, it's empty. It's not real, and that the awakening, the resurrection, so to speak, comes from realizing we're more than that. Leaving the cave.
Yeah. So that's a symbol of transforming your life then from the sleeper life until the awakened.
That's exactly
life.
right.
Mm. One more thing about science before we move on to where you've already guided this discussion now, because we're entering interesting stuff. But I want to say one more thing about the scientific thing.
Yes.
Just to get the more materialistic-minded people that listen to this with us. And that is that not only the quantum entanglement that you mentioned, but you also have probably illustrated best in Schrödinger's cat. You have the fact that it's no longer a question in science about a phenomenon and an observator, and that the observer and observed is distinct. Now they realize that the observer is actually influencing the observation, even scientifically, materially speaking. So you have, in Schrödinger's cat, you have the fact that the cat is both dead and alive at the same time.
Yeah.
And only when you actually investigate it is when it falls down to one of the possibilities. But in fact, now they know that you actually influences with your expectations, with your mind, with your decisions. And this dovetails also with more should we say, fringe scientific notions that's also out there now, like the fact that you can influence water, you can influence your plants. There's so many experiments and discoveries made in these areas, and we're going to have scientists on where we talk about these things. But I think this very much dovetails with what we're talking about here. Yeah, you can take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, you mentioned Schrödinger. You know, one of my favorite quotes of his is he said, multiplicity is only apparent. In truth, there is only one mind.
He said that. Wow.
And he said that. Yeah. I mean, that was Schrödinger, and that was exactly what the Gnostics were saying.
Right.
You know, that look, I mean, we are part of a greater unit, and our so-called individual minds are just part of a greater mind, and our perspectives actually affect the greater unit. And from a scientific standpoint as well, that can be terrifying if you're trying to study science, which is based on distinction. Yeah. One of my favorite episodes in history that people don't talk about very much, but it has to do with when at the beginning of the 20th century, when they began to study subatomic particles and classify subatomic particles. What the scientists found is that whatever particle they could conceive of, when they went to look for it, they found evidence for it. And consequently, they found hundreds of subatomic particles. So much so that they called it the particle zoo, because there was hundreds of these subatomic particles they were finding, because whatever they could conceive, it appeared to be manifesting out of the quantum field. And so what they had to do was narrow down their definition of what a particle could be in order to create a working science. Which means that our entire scientific system as we know it today could just be a subset of a much bigger universe.
It's actually just a projection then.
That's exactly right. And that we are just studying a narrowed down definition of what reality can be.
Wow. Well, I have always been one of those who agrees that particles are actually just frozen observation points of the wave, that the universe is an emanation, an ever emanation of energy, and that if we take our instruments or our senses and just zooms in on parts of that, that's when you get a particle. But as soon as we remove our attention from it again, it's this ever-flowing wave. And that, I think, is more Gnostic when it boils down to it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yep.
And one more observation, by the way. You mentioned Lao, Lao Tse, right? The founder of Taoism. Yeah.
Yes.
Isn't it interesting that about the same time, in the West, you had an enlightened soul we call Pythagoras. In the middle, you had an enlightened soul, Siddhartha, Gautama, the Buddha.
Yeah.
And in the East, you had the Lao Tse. All of them coming to the earth about the same time and putting out traditions, Gnostic traditions that are very similar to each other.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, they're so similar, it's worthy to note that, there were, during the Ming Dynasty, there were Manichaean Gnostics that had made their way into China.
Yeah.
And the Manichaean Gnostics, they celebrated a Gnostic leader, the founder of their Manichaean faith, who went by the name of Mani.
Yeah.
And the members of the Ming Dynasty thought that Mani was just the Buddha of light. And they also thought that he was the reincarnation of Lao Tzu.
Wow.
And so and because the Manichaeans referred to themselves as the religion of light, some people believe this is actually where the Ming dynasty got its name, because in Chinese, Ming means light. And because there were so many Manichaean Gnostics at the Chinese court, that's where the Ming dynasty may have gotten its name from. But the point is that there was, even at that point, there was a recognition of, hey, we have these Taoist thoughts, we have these Buddhist thoughts, and we have these Manichaean Gnostic thoughts, and they all seem to be saying the same thing. Mm-hmm. So,
isn't the word Sufi a derivation of Sophie or Sophia? Or
yeah, that's one theory. One theory is it's from the Greek Sophia, meaning wisdom, and according to the Gnostic traditions, Sophia was represented the soul, and as it came to experience and become an embodiment of wisdom. And this is also the origin, of course, of the word philosophy that was coined by Pythagoras, which is just philosophia, or to love wisdom. And so one theory is that Sufi comes from Sophia, though the other theory is that it comes from wool, the Arabic word for wool, because
that's the most far-fetched.
Right, yeah, I agree.
I've seen better theories.
Yeah, I mean the Sufi do, in their ceremonies they have the dervishes, for example, before they get into their trance to enter into a Gnostic connection with the bigger universal order, they will lay down a lambskin in the east of their temple, and that lambskin represents the unknown master that they are becoming. And with the idea that all great masters in history are all the same master, because they're all coming from the same one mind. Yeah. And so that lambskin just represents that master, and so that's the closest association with wool that the Sufi have. But even there, that wool is more the exoteric meaning, and the Sophia would still be applicable and be the more esoteric or inner meaning behind it.
Yeah, and I've seen even better explanations for that word, but we won't have too much focus on Sufism per se today. When we talk about words, I want to go back to the title of your book. Could you explain us why you call it Entering the Chain of Union? What is the Chain of Union?
Yeah, so within several different esoteric traditions and spiritual movements that have this Gnostic base, they tend to have a ritual in which the members all join hands or link arms and form a circle in which they are all united as one. And symbolically, they form a chain in which unites them with all people who have come to that realization throughout history in the past, and all people who have come to that realization into the future.
So is this the same as the chain of initiation?
The same as the chain of initiation. And in fact,
the lineage.
Yeah, that's right. And you see this worldwide. I mean, I visited Mayan tribes down in Mexico, out in the jungle of the Yucatan, who have these initiation rituals that involve the elements, going through the elements of water, air, and fire. So taking the earth and elevating it, and then getting to the fifth element, quintessence, or the ether, the mind. And even they form this chain of union at the end of their ceremonies, in which they all link arms and form a big circle, and in the center of which they put a sacred flame, that represents the inner fire, that burns within all of them. So, so this is something we find within initiatic traditions and spiritual movements worldwide.
I see. When we look at how the Gnostics came to be in the West, then, what we identify as the Gnostics, obviously, as people have realized by now, it's much broader than just those movements back in that time. But those are the ones who gave the name to it, and those are also probably the latest survivors of those traditions, unless we include the surviving elements within, like, for instance, Islam as in Sufism, or in Judaism as in Kabbalism. But the church were very hard. They smacked down on them at some point.
Yes.
And we also know why, because we've been talking about how it's a challenge to the powers that be. But could we say that there are really any genuine Gnostic groups today who survived?
Yeah, there are Gnostic church systems in the world today. I mean, they're just not very well known, and because most people are asleep, they're not attracted to them. But for example, there's certainly, for example, the Apostolic Johannite Church, or the AJC, is a Gnostic church system. Out in California in the United States, there's churches like the Ecclesia Gnostica, which is in Hollywood or Los Angeles area, or the Gnostic Sanctuary, which is up in San Francisco area. And there are a number of Gnostic church systems around the world. And then there's also initiatic fraternities, which at their core, they are Gnostic systems. Whether their adherents or their followers understand this truth is another matter. But ultimately, they are designed to, through stages of initiation, designed to wake people up to their true nature and get back to that oneness. And
yeah, I've seen many groups like EGC, EGU, EGA, etc. So what they have common is the Ecclesia Gnostica part.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Gnostic Church.
Yeah, Gnostic congregations. But those are the ones with Gnostic in their names. I guess it's safe to assume that most Gnostic groups don't even have it in their name. But if you go to the Middle East, are there still any, should I say, genuine groups among people whose?
Yeah. I mean, there are certain groups that they tend to be persecuted. Certainly, the Mandeans of places like Iraq are a Gnostic group. In fact, the word Mandean comes from Manada, which just means Gnosis in Arabic. There are also groups like the Druze, which continue to exist in places primarily in Lebanon, but also even in places like Syria and Israel and Egypt. And I know quite a bit of Druze even in Nigeria, in Africa. And they're Unitarian Gnostics. And
what about the Sabaeans? Are they still around?
Yeah, Sabaeans, for sure. In fact, the Sabaeans, there's two groups referring to themselves as Sabaeans. The first group comes out of the area of southern Turkey, in the ancient area that was referred to as Haran. And, they tend to be Hermetic Gnostics. And then there's another group.
Hang on, sorry, Tim.
Yeah.
These are not Alevites, right?
Well, the Sabaeans kind of spread out from that area of southern Turkey and are found. Some people believe that they've kind of taken their doctrine and formed new religious sects like the Yazidis and the Alawites and the the Sabaeans are mentioned in the Quran, for example, as being people of the book,
right?
And but they venerated the doctrines of Idris, who is Enoch of the Bible, and also Hermes of Hermes Trismegistus of the Hermetic tradition. So,
hey, speaking of that, did you see that they found a Quran in England that is the oldest known Quran in the world today?
In England?
In England, of all places. It's a very logical explanation why it ended up there, but
yeah.
I can send you the link. It's very new.
That's great.
It's so interesting because we don't have a Quran from the time of Muhammad himself, but this is probably the first one. I'll send you the link.
That's great.
Yeah. But continue.
Well, so the Sabaeans, so that's one of the groups that's named themselves Sabaeans. The other group is out of Ethiopia, and
St. John.
The idea behind that group is that it actually came from Sheba, and Sheba became Saba, which is where the word Sabea comes from. The original root of the word Sabaean probably comes from Saba, which was a Egyptian word that meant star or stars, and the Sabaeans were known to be stargazers and developed astrology, and they were concerned in particular with certain. They believed that if you studied certain star constellations, you would notice cycles that happen in nature and in the movement of consciousness with people, and that because everything was related to this one consciousness. And so this is really the beginning of where the study of astrology came from, and but it went back to this Hermetic principle of as within so without, as above so below, and ultimately it was all part of one mind, and there's signatures within this one mind that you could come to understand by studying nature.
It's so sad, I think, that today, with the rise of fundamentalism, that you have so many, and when the Western powers crush these secular regimes, and in that vacuum you have the fundamentalism rising, all these invaluable old traditions are under siege and are kind of being destroyed in front of our eyes. And of course the people of the West, they have no clue. They don't distinguish. They think they're all Wahhabists. So,
well, and one of the ironies with the Western world is it's become in some ways in its plight to become sectarian and everything else, it has almost become atheistic, and has completely detached itself from anything dealing with consciousness and the greater mind, and which is the root of spiritual understanding. And so they've the West is in some ways kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater.
Precisely.
So it's
very well put.
So it's very hard, you can see why there's a conflict between those who want to be these fundamentalist traditions that want to just accept the dogma of a religious leader without questioning it, versus systems that have completely tried to get rid of spirituality. Of course, there's going to be great conflicts, and the only again reconciliation can come when people start to embrace again that personal gnosis.
Yeah, this goes right in the line of what I talked about in the beginning, that you have these two antagonistic forces. If you look at atheism, they say that everything you can sense is reality, forget about consciousness, and their equivalents are the fundamentalists. They are those who say, no, all this is an illusion, only believe in the afterworld, and they love to fight. And who's trapped in between?
Yeah, that's
Us, the people who are Gnostics, either they know it or not.
Yeah, I have a good story that I'll interject if it's okay, and that has to do with, recently I was in southern France. This was only a few months ago, and I was meeting with a tradition in southern France that was perpetuating a Gnostic Cathar church.
Wow. And
one of the things that came out while we were there is that the Cathar or Albigensian tradition, one of their great landmarks in history was the castle of Montsegur, which is in the Pyrenees, and in which several Cathars were persecuted by the Roman Church. And these Cathar descendants, they had a ceremony, a Gnostic ceremony, a Gnostic mass that they wanted to perform at Montsegur, which is, their traditional place. But they felt like they couldn't do it because France has become so secular that if you do anything in public that even appears the slightest bit religious or spiritual, you will be arrested.
Wow.
And they couldn't afford to put their families and their jobs and everything else at risk to do one of these ceremonies. So they asked me and some of the other people I was with if we could do the ceremony for them, because if we did it at Montsegur and we got arrested, the French authorities would just say, "Oh, well, you're silly Americans," or whatever, and let us go. You know what I mean? We wouldn't be putting anything at risk. But if they were to do it, they would be putting everything at risk. And it's so in this irony in the age of freedom of religion, people really aren't that free.
Yeah, it's true. And you see that it's not only that, but when, let's say then that the fanatical atheists who are fundamentalists in their own right, they don't see the nuances in between, so they want to paint all religious traditions as fundamentalism, and it's so easy for them. Islam is a sitting duck today. So what they do is that they strengthen fundamentalism, or be that Islamic or otherwise, and then you have those Daesh people, these Salafists, these Wahhabists. They want this to happen because they call it the gray zone. You're a Muslim, you come to us, because they persecute you, they smack down on you. You see, you're marginalized. It's the good enemy. It's what they want. They want this. It's a threat to the materialists and the atheists if people become Gnostics, because they become the opposite of crazy. They become actually sound and balanced. So they want people to be fundamentalists, and the fundamentalists wants people to think, no, the only alternative to us is atheism.
Right.
And there you have that artificial dichotomy that kind of burns the real opposition, which is everyone else, which is us.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Real free thinkers.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's sad. But listen, people can liberate themselves, and let's say your book here, Entering the Chain of Union. If people buy that book, what can they expect to read about?
Well, so in it, I explore Gnostic philosophy. I explore how it's manifested in different religious currents, and I also explore how it's shown up within different initiatic and fraternal systems in the world, as well as other religious currents that the common world, shall we say, the profane world normally associates as separate and different, but in fact are all related. And not only are they related in their philosophies, but they're related in their rituals.
And sometimes also historical, right? Like you mentioned Cathars. You have the Bogomils, aren't they Cathars too?
Absolutely, yeah. The Bogomils, a lot of people associate the Bogomils of Bulgaria as a totally separate system as the Cathars in southern France, when in fact they were teaching the same philosophies, and not only that, but they were passing on some of the same Gnostic texts that weren't being passed on by any other group anywhere in the world at the time, which shows that they were really the same system. And so I explore some of those connections for sure, and then I also explore as well how the Knights Templar of the Middle Ages were seeking out and trying to connect with some of these different Gnostic currents.
Now, I'm betting that many who listen to us today will think, okay, one thing is the historical aspect of stuff, but a key question here is how? How can I become enlightened? Do you touch upon this in any way?
I do. I mean, I explore this concept of the levels of awakening, certainly represented by the elements, the classical elements that we talked about before, and I talk about how this shows up in different religious texts, and the idea that these sacred scriptures, these sacred texts are signposts that are drawing, they're a map, but the territory is a place within yourself.
Right.
And so you have to be able to go there within yourself, and the idea is once you're able to get there, once your internal world changes, you find that your external world also changes around you.
Yeah, as within, so without, huh?
That's right. Yeah.
Hey, I have a note I didn't raise with you. I want to ask that before we wrap this up. What about the concept of reincarnation? I mean, if everybody is one, you could say that I am you. And that eventually we will live each other's lives, everyone. I mean, that's just one interpretation. There's so many versions of reincarnation. But how can we squeeze this into the Gnostic concept?
So the Gnostics said that we've developed something that we might call a soul personality, a personality that is distinct from the greater unit, the greater mother unit, the greater oneness. And that this personality at some point lost itself in thinking that was all that was. And that through a process of living a life and gaining experiences and then dying and coming back and gaining new experiences, reincarnating several times, that soul personality would gradually awaken back to its mother unit, back to its source, but that this process takes several lifetimes, and the reason why it takes several lifetimes is because of the stubbornness of the soul personality itself, separating itself, and so to refine everything, to separate the subtle from the gross, as the hermeticists would say, the alchemists would say, it takes a long time of purifications, but that ultimately, when people do get back to that oneness realization, then that soul personality, while being able to exist within that oneness, can exist within the oneness and as a distinct personality simultaneously in realization, and can make a conscious choice at that point if it wants to continue to exist as a distinct entity, and if so, and help others wake up to that point, and can continue to reincarnate until everybody gets it, which is kind of the idea behind the Amitabha Buddha in Buddhism. The idea that look, there's never a true enlightenment, there's never a true gnosis, so to speak, until everybody wakes up.
Yeah, so we can't leave the others behind. We're kind of in it together, stuck in the same shape.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah, and to even try to say, "Oh, well, I'm gonna leave this plane. I'm out of here and see you."
Yeah, you guys fight.
Right, by its very nature shows that you're really not in the oneness, because all these other, everything else that's a part of it is still, you hasn't woken up to it yet.
Yeah, but that's great. It's an incentive even to the biggest egomaniacs to it's an incentive to be empathic and reach out.
That's right.
Because if you're a spiritual, ambitious person, and oh my God, I need to ascend to the level of the higher beings, even then you can't leave your brethren behind.
Yeah, that's right. And this is really the true meaning behind and the true purpose behind fraternity and fraternities, for that matter. Was the idea that, look, these are organizations of people who come together in oneness, and it helps them learn to become interdependent, and it helps get them back to the one mind.
Right.
And people may not join it for that reason, but ultimately that's the result of what happens.
Yeah, and I guess this ties also into the question of how, because even though it is a path for us to take alone, nobody here wants to or needs to reinvent the wheel, right? We're all standing on shoulders upon shoulders. So I guess the idea of mystery schools then is precisely to help each other get it.
Yes. That's completely the entire purpose. We're each rays of the same sun, and
And that's the purpose of your own organization too, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're all part of what's one human family within the one mind of the one Creator, and we all have to wake up to that. So.
I wish we could end on that beautiful tangent, but I have even one more note I want to raise with you before we end it here.
Okay.
And that is the concept of the snake in paradise.
Yeah.
The tree of knowledge.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. Because this is an important part of the Gnostic myths, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I guess we should touch upon it.
Yeah, to the Gnostics, the serpent who had Eve taste the forbidden fruit was not, and opened Eve's eyes to knowledge, wasn't evil per se. All the tasting of that fruit did is open the consciousness to the dual nature of things.
So they became self-aware, right?
Became self-aware.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm naked, I'm ashamed. They weren't before.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So it's from innocence to maturity. It's what you talked about, the rebirth.
Right, and that ultimately, the thing is we have to work through those dualities to get back to the oneness.
Right.
Only we work back to it with appreciation and with our eyes open to what we're a part of, as opposed to, being in ignorant bliss.
Yeah, that is bliss.
Yeah. So, and for this reason too, I should point out that within the ancient languages, the Greek language and the Hebrew language, and in other languages, every letter also corresponds to a number. And so the word serpent, or nehesh, for example, in Hebrew, if you take the letters that compose that word and you transliterate out their number values through a science called gematria, it adds up to the number 358 or 358. And the word Messiah in Hebrew also adds up to the number 358. And so to the Gnostics, this was there was a relationship here. And so the idea of Moses erecting the serpent on a cross in the wilderness, was a metaphor for this greater process that you also find symbolically illustrated by Jesus later on the cross. But it's really about this idea of awakening. And I should point out from a Pythagorean standpoint that you start out with God, who is one, and then you fall into duality, in which you encounter the serpent, or nehesh, which adds up to 358. What you have outlined there is the Fibonacci sequence, which is found in all of nature. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. So this is the Gnostics considered this is part of the science of consciousness. That was found in sacred texts, but also how it manifested in the world. And again, it goes back to that idea of there being many levels or layers to sacred scripture and myth. Yeah. And this is just one more aspect of it.
Oh, this opens so many associations. We could sit here and philosophize the rest of the day, but we're at the top of the hour, unfortunately. So, right. Yeah, I think we have to throw in the towel for today. But what little we have touched upon, and believe us, folks, we've only scratched the surface. But what little we have touched upon, I hope, can give a little appetizers to explore this deeper. Now, if anyone wants to, and I'm sure you would be the first to say that your school is not the only one or the right one, etc.
Correct. Yeah.
I mean, it's you who we have here now. So if they want to explore yours, how would they expect, how would their Gnostic journey be through your guidance?
Well, the tradition I represent is connected with CIRCES International, and people could go to circesinternational.org, and CIRCES is spelled CIRCES, which is just a French acronym for the International Circle for Spiritual Research and Study, basically. So it's it's a school that tries to study these different traditions from around the world, and it is a school that has Templar foundations to it. It was set up and developed by the Knights Templar tradition, and that I represent, and so it's certainly a way for people to explore several different venues of Gnostic belief system, and then from there they can certainly go and study and focus more in depth between any one of these different venues that still exist out there.
Okay. As usual, people, if you go to our presentation of Tim at our guest presentation page, you'll find all the essential links. So you don't have to memorize that web address.
Great.
Yeah. So I have to thank you for put time off your busy schedule to drop by us today, Tim.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And if God willing, inshallah, we'll have you back soon to discuss a similar topic.
Inshallah.
That's it.
And that's it for today. We hope you enjoyed that we put forth a somewhat philosophical talk show for you this time, as it will be part of several similar approaches for future programs. Also, a big thanks to our recent donators, especially that one generous lady. You guys really helped us get the last programs out there. If you can't contribute to financing the forum, hopefully you lend us a hand and spread our work and online pages to your network. Before parting, consider these selections from the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, which is as old as the 4 canonical Gospels. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. The kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. Recognize what is in your sight, and that which is hidden from you will become plain to you. For there is nothing hidden that will not become manifest. His disciples said, "When will the kingdom come?" It will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying, "Here it is," or "There it is." Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and men do not see it. End of quote. Remember that the words of advice above the Pythian temple portal of Delphi in ancient Greece didn't just say, "Know thyself," a much more profound task than most would believe at first glance, but that the full quotation is, "Know thyself, and you shall know the gods and cosmos." Until our paths cross again, sincerely, from your host Al and the Borealis team. Be seeing you.
Who is number one?